The bowel wall is packed with muscle. That muscle is in a smooth muscle syncytium. And as a smooth muscle syncytium, the muscle cells are connected in one seamless network of gap junctions and connections that make it beat as one. And the muscular capacity has a resting membrane potential that, if you're not thinking about resting membrane potential, you go, yeah, whatever, minus 40, minus 65, who cares? But it's very significant if you think that the more positive it is, the easier it is to depolarize. If you have a resting membrane potential of minus 50, and the other has a resting membrane potential of minus 70, which one depolarizes easier? This is one of those things I don't think people think through enough. The more positive it is, the easier it is to depolarize. The more positive it is, the easier it is to depolarize. When the resting membrane potential is minus 40, it depolarizes much easier than if it was minus 80. The more positive the resting membrane potential, the easier it is to depolarize. The interstitial cells of Cajal look an awful lot like the nodal tissue that is in the heart. If you section the bowel and look at the interstitial cells of Cajal, not Cajal, the interstitial cells of Cajal, these pacemaker cells, like all pacemaker cells, have an oscillating membrane potential. The slow waves. In the heart, it'd be called an unstable phase 4. That means they're always busy going somewhere, aren't they? Always busy going on to its next step. The action potentials are generated if the threshold is reached. Threshold happens at around minus 40. The more positive you are, the closer you are to threshold. And the slow channels open and the sodium and the calcium go in. Now, the part of the GI tract that contracts the most is the duodenum. The duodenum has the most frequent rate of contraction. The duodenum is practically tachycardic compared to the stomach. The stomach beats at around 3 times a minute. The duodenum beats at 10 to 12 times a minute. Here's a pathologic correlate for you. What is the most likely mechanism of irritable bowel syndrome? An irritable bowel is most likely a person whose resting membrane potential in terms of its ability to depolarize is the most positive. That's what makes it the pacemaker tissue. The duodenum contracts the most at 12, about 12 a minute. The stomach contracts the least. The motor activity is largely based on stretch. The smooth muscle of the bowel is a smooth muscle syncytium. Now, syncytium means that all those cells are connected together. When you stretch one, they all contract back. You see, the smooth muscle of the bowel is connected by gap junctions. A gap junction is hard to understand for people because unlike a synapse at the neuromuscular junction where you have norepinephrine or acetylcholine going across a synapse and it literally floats across, still hits there, kind of like an ovulating egg, you have to float across and hit the fimbria. Well, what happens in a gap junction is that the gap junction, you're simultaneously in both cells at the same time. It's kind of like a wormhole. And the gap junctions create this syncytium so that the entire muscular network contracts as one. There are slow waves that go through the bowel, and they create low-level contractions and action potentials that strengthen those contractions as you go through in slow waves. The intrinsic motor activity created by the pacemaker activity of the interstitial cells is different based on the level of the bowel. It's slower in the stomach at around 3 times a minute, faster in the duodenum at about 8 or 10, 10 or 12, 10 or 12, 14 times sometimes a minute, and in the middle between the colon and the jejunum and the ileum. But remember, the more positive the resting membrane potential, the closer it is to threshold, and the closer it is to contraction. Tonic contractions means contracted all the time, and that is sphincters. Vasoactive intestinal peptide relaxes them. The myenteric plexuses of the gut have 2 different names, whether you want to call them plexuses or plexi. Nobody will understand you if you call them plexi. But the myenteric plexus of Auerbach is in between 2 different layers of muscle. in between two different layers of the muscle external, of the muscularis externa, of the one that creates the longitudinal movements that result in mass movements through the bowel. Do you still have bowel movements when you don't eat? And the answer is yes, you still have bowel movements when you don't eat. How can you have bowel movements when you don't eat? What's a bowel movement made up of? Did you know that half the volume of stool is GI epithelial cells? Half the volume of stool is GI epithelial cells. That means that even when you don't eat, the GI epithelium accumulates and contracts through with the peristalsis that happens anyway, whether you eat or don't eat. Now, swallowing is complicated because there's two different types of swallowing. The primary peristaltic wave is conscious. It's in the upper esophageal sphincter. The primary peristaltic wave is conscious, the upper esophageal sphincter, and you can see it in a cadaver. The secondary peristaltic wave is lower down. It's more automatic. It's based on stretch of smooth muscle syncytium. The primary peristaltic wave is skeletal muscle. The secondary peristaltic wave is smooth muscle syncytium. Now, the efferent for this is from the vagus for all these things. Now, whether the efferent, as the vagus, is happening directly with acetylcholine, more constriction, more secretion, more constriction, more secretion, or whether it involves the upper esophageal sphincter, primary peristaltic wave, or relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter, it's essentially all vagally mediated. This is why people have strokes of cranial nerves 10 and 11. Cranial nerves 10 and 11 have aspiration pneumonia because they're having disordered swallowing. And also the vagus releases vasoactive inhibitory peptide so that even through the vagus, what opens that sphincter so the food goes forward? VIP. But the VIP is as a result of the vagus. And this also puts in relaxation of the proximal stomach. Now you might say, hey, fishy, didn't you tell us that relaxation of guts stops contraction? That stops stuff from moving forward? Yes, I did say that. Then why would I want to relax the proximal stomach if that inhibits forward motility? And the answer is we want to relax it so that you have capacitance. In order for the bowels to be filled, they have to relax and receive the food. And relaxation of the proximal stomach will have a receptive relaxation. And what that means is your stomach can go from 50 milliliters when it's small to 2 to 3 liters. And competitive eaters, like on 4th of July hot dog eating contests, where they're eating 55 and 60 hot dogs in 20 minutes, disgusting! They have receptive relaxation. They feel the stretch, they dilate more. They feel more stretch, they dilate more. Well, why not have it just be dilated all the time? Well, what would be the greatest stimulant to movement? What's the greatest stimulant to secretions? What's the greatest stimulant to gastrin? The answer to these is all the same. Stretch, distension. So if you're already very, very, very wide, you won't sense the stretch. That's why it has to start contracted and then receptively relax to being larger. An increase in sympathetic activity will slow all GI processes because sympathetic slows both motility and slows secretions in the GI tract. Now, the Gastro-Esophageal Junction is the junction between basically the stomach and the esophagus. So that's why you'll see on the left of this picture, the stratified squamous epithelium is inside the esophagus. And on the right of the picture is the columnar epithelium that happens inside the stomach. That's normal. Now, what's it called when the columnar epithelium of the stomach extends into the esophagus? What's that disease called? When the columnar epithelium of the stomach extends into the esophagus, that's called Barrett's esophagus. Barrett's esophagus, or columnar metaplasia. Barrett's esophagus, when the stratified squamous on the left starts becoming simplified columnar epithelium. The upper esophageal sphincter is under conscious control. It's skeletal muscle. Conscious, awake, self-initiated. That's the primary peristaltic wave. Secondary peristaltic waves are a reflex, based on it being a smooth muscle syncytium. And the lower esophageal sphincter is basically not visible in anatomy. It's a different sense of receptivity to different transmitters. The upper esophageal sphincter is anatomic. You could see it in a cadaver. Lower esophageal sphincter is based on sensitivity. Like saying that all men have ears, but you can't tell what kind of music they are sensitive to just by looking at it. Achalasia is defined as incomplete relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter. It's where the lower esophageal sphincter fails to relax because there's an abnormality of the Myenteric plexus, the enteric plexus. You're missing those nerves, and you have incomplete relaxation in the lower esophageal sphincter. Now, what ends up happening about achalasia is that you have dysphagia for both solids and liquids. And the primary peristalsis in the esophageal body is poor because you're missing those plexuses of nerves. And that gives a resting pressure in the lower esophageal sphincter that's abnormally high, and it slows down the passage of swallowed materials, giving this bird's beak that you see here. Achalasia is an esophagus that's all stuffed up, and it needs to be dilated with either pneumatic dilation or surgically. Now, if achalasia is a lower esophageal sphincter that is too tight, reflux disease is a lower esophageal sphincter that's too loose. GERD, or Gastro-Esophageal Reflux Disease, is a sphincter that is abnormally loose, and it gets more loose with nicotine, alcohol, caffeine, and chocolate. Nicotine, alcohol, caffeine, and chocolate. Nicotine, alcohol, caffeine, and chocolate. Will nicotine, alcohol, caffeine, and chocolate dilate achalasia? And the answer is no. But reflux disease is an abnormal dilation that's happening all the time. It's extraordinarily common. So the lower esophageal sphincter is not able to maintain adequate tone, and you get erosions with the reflux of the stomach acid into the esophagus. Is reflux disease associated with Helicobacter pylori? No. Reflux disease is neither caused by Helicobacter pylori, nor does it predispose to Helicobacter pylori. It's just heartburn. And it changes it into columnar metaplasia of the lower esophagus. Diffuse esophageal spasm, which is very similar to nutcracker esophagus, just as a different neuromuscular pressure pattern, is a neuromuscular disorder. We're not really clear why it happens, diffuse esophageal spasm, but we know that you get chest pain, and definitely when it first presents, it looks like you're having a myocardial infarction, because it's a terrible crushing substernal chest pain. And a barium swallow may sometimes elicit the spasm, so you can see it. You might say, because people usually say, well, why should you do a barium swallow? Because, will you be swallowing here? Why should you do a barium swallow? Because if you're not having the spasm, what are you going to see? And weirdly enough, what ends up happening is that the barium swallow itself can evoke the spasms. Isn't that interesting? Gastric motility and gastric secretions are extremely similar to each other in their stimuli. So that's why you're going to see that inside the stomach, the BER, it says basic electrical rhythm, is 3 times a minute. Wow, your stomach really does have a brain. Isn't that amazing? Yes, it does. Now, when you increase acetylcholine, does it increase the force of these contractions or the frequency? The force or the frequency? And the answer is it increases the force. It's very easy to misunderstand and say it'll increase the frequency. It doesn't. Parasympathetic stimulation can stimulate gastrin by 2 reasons. One, acetylcholine will end up stimulating gastric releasing peptide, and the other is parasympathetic will simultaneously make the acetylcholine go up, which causes more contraction, and gastrin-releasing peptide. And then the gastrin increases GI motility. Gastrin increases GI motility. Parasympathetic stimulation will also stimulate through the vagus VIP. VIP will open the sphincters. And now, once inside the duodenum, fat, acid, distension, and osmolality will all slow GI motility, but that's only once the food is inside the stomach. When you're just hanging around outside, then what ends up happening is that the distension of the stomach makes more contraction of the stomach. but distension of the duodenum decreases contraction of the stomach. As distension of the stomach causes vagus more motility. Distension of the stomach causes acetylcholine more motility. Distension of the stomach causes parasympathetic, gastrin-releasing peptide, which also increases motility. But inside the duodenum, fat, acid, distension, and anything that is osmolar will slow down GI motility. What leaves the stomach the fastest? What substance? Now, many of you are probably thinking water. But water is not as fast as normal saline. The closer things are to normal saline, the faster they leave the stomach. So water is close, but normal saline is the fastest. That's why when runners are in marathons, they don't hand out glasses of water. They hand out something that looks like Gatorade. Saliva is 90% under the control of the neural system. The pancreas is 90% under the control of the hormonal system. But the stomach is 1/3 endocrine, 1/3 neural, 1/3 paracrine. Paracrine is histamine. Paracrine is cells nearby. Now, the stimulation of acetylcholine and gastrin increase parasympathetic activity. Well, in one sense, you could say that parasympathetic activity is acetylcholine. This is local distension or stretch because it's a smooth muscle sensation. Now, acid has feedback inhibition on gastrin. Gastrin increases parasympathetic activity. Yeah, and parasympathetic activity increases gastrin. So remember that the only one of the GI hormones that's under feedback inhibition is gastrin. And neural and hormonal feedback from the duodenum slow down gastric secretions and motility. Fat, acid, and distension of the duodenum slow the stomach. If normal saline is the fastest thing to leave, what's the slowest? Fat. Pepperoni pizza with extra cheese will take 3 hours. Liquids go out faster than carbohydrates. That's what CHO means, carbohydrates. And the slowest thing is fat. Liquids is fastest and fats is slowest. And that's because fats also have more calories in them. In the biochemistry section, you'll see how many more calories per gram fat has. So you need time for that fat to release its calories. And that's why it goes out the slowest. And liquids, particularly ones with just a little salt and sugar, that's why Gatorade needs no digestion. Well, for the ordinary person, digestion and absorption are pretty much the same thing, but not for us. For us, we have to know distinctly that fats need a lot of digestion, needs to be broken up into little pieces, and absorption is where it actually makes it across the bowel wall. The pylorus is a sphincter, and it controls the rate of stomach emptying. The more the pyloric sphincter is tightened, the slower it leaves. And that's why cholecystokinin, GIP, and secretin tighten up your pyloric sphincter. CCK, incretins, and secretin all slow GI secretions. CCK in response to fat. Fat slows the stomach. GIP and GLP in response to carbohydrates. Secretin in response to acids. Unreinforced learning doesn't stick. So if I say something to you like GIP, GLP, and I say they're incretins, and I say synthetic versions of those incretins are exenatide and liraglutide, and I say that things that block the metabolism of the incretins is sitagliptin, sexagliptin, linagliptin, sitagliptin, sexagliptin, linagliptin, then you ought to go and stop what you're doing now and look those things up. As we move down the bowel, and we go from the stomach and into the duodenum, and into the small intestine, we see that rhythmic contractions in adjacent sections both mix segmentation contractions and move, such as peristaltic contractions, and the waves of contraction go from top to bottom, and that happens mostly in response to stretch of the stomach. At the other end of the stomach, down at the other end, there's the ileocecal valve, ileocecal sphincter between the terminal ileum and the colon. Now, the ileocecal valve should be able to be reached by colonoscopy. You should be able to cannulate the ileocecal valve. What goes through the ileocecal valve should really be the consistency of brown urine. There should be no food by the time you hit the ileocecal valve. There should be no fats, no carbohydrates, and no proteins by the time you hit the ileocecal valve. By the time you hit the ileocecal valve, the only thing that should be left down there is waste products, water, and salt. Salt and water, basically. And the ileocecal valve is more like the sphincter on a bladder, because what goes through the ileocecal valve is very close to urine consistency. Distension of the ileum will open that sphincter, and distension of the colon will constrict that sphincter. Both of those are logical, because it means that if you got stuff on the ileum side, hey, open the door, man, I'm trying to get into that colon. And if you have distension on the colon side, it says, slow down, we're full in here already. Segmentation contractions are the bulges along the colon. And you get these mass movements, and they're more prolonged, and they're basically a long peristalsis. This is how we form the stool. Remember that you continue to have bowel movements even when you don't eat, because you have to get rid of GI epithelial cells. This is why small bowel cancer is so profoundly rare. It's like a person who takes all their clothing and actually throws out all their clothes once every 5 days. So, listen, I bet you don't get dirt on your clothes. Why? Because I throw out all my clothes every 5 days. And that's the intestinal lining. It sloughs its entire lining once every 5 days. One of Dr. Fisher's favorite hormonal situations is the migrating myoelectric complex. Matter of fact, if I ever had a restaurant, I would probably name it Migrating Myoelectric Complex, like food to go. Why is it that we continue to have bowel movements? Well, you just said that you lose half the volume of your stool is GI epithelium. But what moves it forward? If there's no stretch, what moves it? Well, this is like flossing. In between meals, an hour and a half or 2 hours after you finish eating, there's a wave that goes from top to bottom. Sort of like flossing your whole GI tract with dental floss that's 45 feet long. Remember, you have 40 feet of bowel plus an extra couple of feet of esophagus and stomach. 30 feet of small bowel, 12 feet of large bowel, and a couple of feet extra for your esophagus. This is based on a fantastic hormone called motilin. Now, motilin moves the undigested material from the stomach and small intestine into the colon from top to bottom in one big movement. And every hour and a half or 2 hours it goes through during fasting. I want to be clear here. It will say it is interrupted by eating. And one movement reaches a distal ileum, another one begins in the stomach, and is interrupted by eating. Motilin is a great name for a hormone, isn't it? What's that hormone do? It puts you in motion. Isn't that fantastic? Motil out? No, motil in. And it goes forward. This is also why erythromycin makes you vomit and have diarrhea. The antibiotic erythromycin makes you vomit and have diarrhea because it increases motilin. This is also why erythromycin can be used for diabetic gastroparesis. Diabetic gastroparesis is where you don't have enough motion. You give them erythromycin and it increases the motion by increasing motilin. So you could say, Goldilocks in the three motions, Goldilocks in the three motilins. You can say, oh, this person has diabetic gastroparesis, this motion is too little, this motion is too small. Oh, you take erythromycin, I bet you're having nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, this motilin is too much. But then you take a person with diabetic gastroparesis and put them on erythromycin, you say, this motilin is just right. Goldilocks in the three motilins. And it basically prevents the backflow of bacteria from the colon into the ileum. You gotta have one way. You think of it like the relative refractory period for your nerves. You've got to have one-way motion. When I was first studying neuroscience, I thought, man, refractory period, why is it refractory? You should be ready to depolarize all the time. Nice idea, except the only way you can get one-way motion is to have it be refractory behind you. Defecation, excitation, moving the constipation, defecation, Reflex. Yeah, sure, it's reflex. Yeah, sure. Did you know actually when you dilate your stomach, that actually has an effect on your colon, empties you out? Yeah, there's a mass movement happens every couple of hours. It's a reflex, relaxation of the sphincters, and it basically, you have to have voluntary contraction, and you only have to have it voluntary in the external anal sphincter. The same way when you urinate, there is a urinary sphincter that is closed all the time, but another urinary sphincter that's under your voluntary control. And it's the same thing with the anal sphincter. Now, this is a complicated muscle contraction. Is that anal sphincter under tonic contraction or relaxation? Well, if you're not certain whether it's under tonic contraction or relaxation, you should look underneath you on the floor. If yours is relaxed all the time, I bet the floor beneath your seat right now is somewhat brown. And then you realize that it's under tonic contraction.